Republicans would consider a kind
It's
of
as I said out in the Garden Remembers, we organised this event to commemorate the laying of flowers to commemorate all those who died in the struggle for Irish freedom, particularly those who died in the war to defend the Republic. And then this afternoon we were going to follow on with, that was our major defeat for the Republican goal for the Republican forces in Ireland in 1923. How Republican forces regrouped, regathered, what lessons did they appear to learn from that defeat, and what lessons they probably didn't learn, what do we learn from that to apply today. We follow then on we'll have questions and answers, and then we'll have tea and coffee, and then we'll have the second section of the afternoon. So the first person just call upon is Brian Hanley. Brian is probably no stranger to public meetings here in Dublin around this particular topic, and on the left and Republican circles. Brian has written a number of books on republicanism, on the working class, on the question of the role of the media and through the whole Troubles and stuff. And probably his most important work was the IRA 1926-36, to a degree something like the topic we'll be discussing now in this whole area. So with those my brief words, I call upon Brian to open up his paper.
Okay, will I stand?
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Eugene, and thanks to the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum for the invitation to speak here today. As time is of the essence, this will be broad brush strokes, which means nuance is out the window if it was ever going to be present in my presentation. In 1976, the National Graves Association published a new edition of The Last Post. It was actually the first edition of this since the 1930s. And it summed up the years from 1923 to 38 as a valley period of inaction, playing with politics, and veering to the left. This, it asserted, came to an abrupt end in the early 1940s, when an uncompromising new leader and his faction of like-minded supporters brought the IRA back into action. Now, the leader they were referring to was Sean Russell, but needless to say, this is an inaccurate, to put it mildly, characterisation of the post-Civil War era. I mean, they're talking about almost 20 years. It was actually a period of intense Republican activity, when the IRA still represented a mass movement, though one containing a very broad spectrum of opinions. So in this period, from 23 to 38 alone, you have the IRA's break with Sinn Féin, you have the formation of Fianna Fáil, you have the establishment of Saor Éire in 1931, whose programme was probably the most left-wing ever adopted by Republicans, certainly up till the very modern era. You've got a consequent state clampdown and Red Scare, Fianna Fáil coming to power in 1932 with the support of the IRA, the emergence of the Blue Shirts, the outdoor relief riots in Belfast, various electoral interventions by Republicans in the north, the 1935 pogroms in Belfast, the Republican Congress split, the impact of the war in Spain on Irish politics, and so on. So you also at the same time have Republican involvement in land agitation, strikes, housing campaigns, as well as a whole variety of links with global political forces. So I think to obviously characterise it, as some Republicans in the 1970s did, and there's reasons why they did, of course, as a period of inaction and so on, is absolutely wrong. And from the late 1920s until 1933 to 34, the left were actually in the ascendant politically within the IRA. So much so that the IRA's Chief of Staff, Moss Toomey, could say in An Phoblacht during 1931 that if it is communism to undo the conquest, to destroy landlordism, to end robbery and exploitation by a privileged minority, then Tone, Emmett, Mitchell, Lawler, Connolly, Pearse and Mellows were communists, and the Irish Republican Army is a communist organisation. Now, to put that in perspective, the people in the 1960s, whether you agree with them or not, who were trying to move the Republican movement leftward, would never have said that. Carl Goulding and Tomás McGilla denied having anything to do with communism until the 1970s. And certainly the Republicans of the 1950s would have been astounded that an IRA Chief of Staff would have said that the IRA are implicitly communist. So this was big. It also reflects something about wider Irish society at the time that was to change fairly dramatically. Now, in this period then you have people like Peadar O'Donnell, obviously, George Gilmore, David Fitzgerald, Mick Fitzpatrick, Sheila Humphreys, Etna Coyle, Sean McCool, later on Frank Ryan and Mick Price, as well as local Republican leaders like Sean McGuinness in Offaly or Brian Corrigan in Achill, who essentially agree with the need to mobilise popular support to try and organise on the basis of social agitation, and who also generally broadly agree with identifying with the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution and global anti-imperialism. And there's obviously, again, a lot more to that they could talk about. They were still a minority, I think, within the IRA, but they were a very, very influential one. There was a much larger group, who Moss Toomey and Sean McBride and others would have been identified, who basically went along with this while it seemed to work. In the context of the Great Depression, mass unemployment, the stopping of immigration, they felt that these policies gave the IRA some chance of getting support. And they were broadly radical anyway. And there was others within the IRA whose politics were more fluid, including obviously a very strong section who were only interested in armed action. But nevertheless, there was plenty of armed action at the time, so they were mollified to some extent. So in 1933, for example, Sean Russell, the IRA's Quartermaster General, usually identified by both friend and foe as being just a militarist, was in Belfast directing the IRA's operations during a railway strike. And his report to Moss Toomey is worth quoting because Russell said, "It is the most promising of all to find B specials who are on strike in search of IRA assistance. What a change to find one group of specials searching the houses of our men while another can be found collaborating with them. The bombs used upon the railway station in Belfast a few days ago, causing considerable damage, were supplied by the OC Belfast and thrown by B specials." Now, while Unionists might have been horrified to hear that, I actually think Northern Nationalists probably would have been fairly horrified to hear it too, because this is less than a decade after the pogroms, remember. But it reflects something about the IRA's thinking about the North as well, which people may want to come back to. One important factor in the left's influence on republicanism was their anti-fascism, and this shouldn't be taken for granted. Mussolini was extremely popular among Irish Republicans in the 1920s. He was a supporter of the movement for independence. All kinds of figures in Irish society praised him for a variety of reasons. The exception was the Labour movement, actually, in the 20s. And by the 30s, because of the influence of O'Donnell and others, the Republican press began to denounce Italian fascism as well. And again, even things like the invasion of Abyssinia, that was popular in nationalist Ireland. People thought Mussolini was in the right. The Republican Congress by that stage obviously stood out against that. Similarly, on Faubourg denounced Hitlerism from 1933, and the Republican Congress was central to anti-fascist organising after 1934. But by then the IRA had split, and one factor in that split had been the attitude of the IRA to the emergence of an Irish fascist movement. And that attitude was officially to ignore them. You'll hear again and again people talking about the IRA fighting the blue shirts. The IRA as an organisation did not agree with fighting the blue shirts. It actually saw this, in their own words, as little better than faction fighting. Moss Toomey said in 1933, "We don't want brawls because it is a short distance from scrapping matches to guns." Violence against the blue shirts by IRA volunteers were described as acts of treachery by the Army Council later that year, and I can give you the full quote. Now, what's very interesting, of course, is that thousands of Republicans did fight the blue shirts, but this was actually indicative of what the IRA leadership saw as a complete breakdown in discipline in their organisation. But I suppose we need to be clear what we're talking about again, because what we are talking about is still something of a mass movement. 15,000 volunteers in 1924, that declines, comes up again to maybe 20,000 in 1933. So that's a lot of men, and that's not counting Cumann Mon or other organisations as well. Proportionately better armed than the IRA had been during the War of Independence. In the 1920s, by their own account, they had 4,000 rifles, 100 or so machine guns, 1,000 plus handguns. That's much more than the IRA had between 1919 and 1921 for far more volunteers. But on reflection, they were actually very restrained because most of this material never left dumps. And that was partially because the focus of the IRA was not on renewing a guerrilla war. It was on insurrection at the head of a popular revolution. And that's why they've got people training as pilots in the United States. And they're interested in anti-aircraft and naval defence and all these kind of things. By modern standards, of course, the 1930s can seem like an exceptionally violent time in Irish politics. Now, I was thinking about this again because I was thinking 20 years ago I'd have said that in confidence, but I mean things have begun to change again more recently. But the context is important. Between 1916 and 1923, about 3,500 people were killed in Ireland as a result of political violence. From the 20s up till the late 30s, maybe 50 people died. as a result of political violence. So there is a big drop in deadly violence, quite obviously, in this period, although the shadow of the revolution obviously is still very apparent. The IRA was also, of course, different. By 1931, Moss Toomey was saying most of our volunteers attained manhood since the last war. The vast majority of IRA volunteers by the 1930s were not veterans of the War of Independence or the Civil War. A lot of the officers were, but the ordinary recruits weren't. And how could they be if you're trying to recruit 18 or 19 or 20-year-olds? They're people who were simply too young. And that had consequences too in terms of the culture wars with Fianna Fáil and so on. I think the IRA by the 1930s was a more working class organisation in terms of its ordinary membership than it had been during the War of Independence, except again maybe the officers, and again that's maybe a longer story. It was obviously, for many reasons, much larger in the 26 counties than it was in the north. And it was generally very much focused on the politics of the 26 counties and the Free State. And I suspect there was still a bit of residual bitterness about the north during the Civil War. And that's why An Phoblacht could publish articles in 1934, for example, accusing Northern nationalists of having no one else to blame but themselves for what had befallen on them since partition. And again, people may want to expand on that. Now, when I say there was a diversity of opinions, I think the immediate post-Civil War IRA leadership and a substantial part of their base were quite amazingly pragmatic. And it's become clear to me, I suppose, a lot clearer than it even was 20 years ago. The reason I'm saying 20 years is because that's when I originally wrote about Moss Toomey and so on. It's become a lot clearer to me in the last few years, I suppose, of looking at the Civil War, that the majority of anti-treatyite Republicans would have avoided the Civil War if they could. That the people who were kind of presented as diehards and hardliners and the ones who'd reject everything, most of them would have come up with a compromise along with De Valera. They were forced into the Civil War by the pro-treatyites and by the British, essentially. And certainly after the Civil War, I don't think Frank Aiken and the majority of the IRA leadership were ever going back to it. Whatever they said publicly in 1923 about there will be another day, I think they had already abandoned any idea of that kind of military struggle. And I think they and the people who founded Fianna Fáil, certainly De Valera, recognised something which the Communist Party had said in July 1922 in the Workers' Republic, actually. The Communist Party said, and the Civil War had already begun, a big percentage of the Irish are apathetic to the struggle. This is particularly true of the landless peasants and the workers and in the towns and cities. So I think there was a big constituency out there, including a large working class constituency, who could have been won to what you might call a form of populist Republican politics, that were not in the least bit interested in rerunning the fight over the treaty. And that included, as I say, a large portion of the working class. In 1934, a Fine Gael TD in Meath sneered that De Valera's party was now getting the votes of the old separation women. And he had a point, because the type of people who were often dismissed by Republicans as the rabble in 1918 or 1919 were voting for Fianna Fáil by the 1930s. Fianna Fáil swept up chunks of the old working class Home Rule vote, the Labour vote, and so on. And they expanded their base. This is the interesting thing, because I thought about this today when I was thinking about what I was going to say here. And in July 1927, I mean, you all know this, but maybe we don't think through how big this was. In July 1927, De Valera and most of the IRA's Civil War leadership entered Leinster House and took the oath of allegiance. Now, that's 4 years after the Civil War. That's 4 years after the executions. That's 4 years after the murder gang. They entered into a parliament where they were sitting directly across from the people who they'd had a war against. That's a lot bigger than Michelle O'Neill going to the coronation. Way bigger, to be absolutely honest with you. And Fianna Fáil lost nobody. Their vote went up, their base went up, and more IRA officers left the IRA during the summer of 1927 to join Fianna Fáil. So this is, when you think about this is amazing pragmatism, if you want to call it that. And yet, what the IRA doesn't do, again, is call them traitors. Peadar O'Donnell doesn't call De Valera a traitor. Peadar O'Donnell says, now we've got to work with these people, we've got to bring them into our campaigns. And he spends a lot of time over the next few years trying to bring Fianna Fáil and its activists and its TDs into the campaign against the land annuities and so on. And if he was calling them traitors, he couldn't really have done that. And of course, Fianna Fáil are in government by 1932. And as I said, it's significant that the IRA don't consider this an act of gross betrayal. When you think about it, it's absolutely phenomenal. there's really less angst expressed about it than there is online about, as I say, Michelle O'Neill and the coronation. The IRA ultimately thought Fianna Fáil getting into government was an opportunity to reorganise. As Moss Toomey put it in 1932, nobody visualised a free state which Republicans were not supposed to attack. And that is just what we have today in the 26 counties. We don't want the Cosgrave Imperial gang back, and we wish to avoid doing anything that may provide the pretext for their comeback. Now, Peadar O'Donnell and others ultimately come to regret this and to obviously criticise it. But nevertheless, this is the opinion of the IRA and a very large section of the Republican movement in the late 20s and early 30s. They want Fianna Fáil to come to power, and they're obviously prepared to support them. Now, why do we not think about it like that a lot of the time? And why wouldn't have I thought about it like that? And I didn't even think about it like that 20 years ago. Partially because the 1940s generation of Republicans wrote the histories. And for them, as you know, De Valera was the man who jailed them, De Valera was the man who hanged them, and we often assume then that the views that are expressed in publications like the Wolf Tone Annual, edited by Brian O'Higgins from the 40s onwards, are what Republicans thought about De Valera back in 1927, when they simply weren't. And it suggests something to me about Republicans and Republican ideology, and it's also perhaps because we pay very little attention to what the mainstream Republican movement was saying between 1919 and 1921, the high point really of the struggle for independence. Yet people pay almost no attention to what Republicans said at that time. We pay a lot of attention to the left, which is fair enough. This is the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum. We pay some attention to the people who wrote the story after 1939, because they planted bombs or they wrote lots of stuff about executions and so on. We don't actually look at what Sinn Féin said in 1920 or 1921, and it kind of provides a clue, because they were ruthlessly pragmatic. Republicans went all over the world and they told every single group they met what that group wants to hear. So I think it says something about republicanism and how it can adapt to all kinds of circumstances. The 1940s generation, who were they? Well, the other group within the Republican movement, the smallest one in the 20s and 30s, were the people around Sinn Féin. Purist, by the late 30s, ever more right-wing, people like J.J. O'Kelly, Skellig, Brian O'Higgins, Count Plunkett, Mary McSweeney, and so on. The one exception, ironically, was a priest, Father Michael O'Flanagan, who was far to the left of the other people in Sinn Féin. And they dominate the narrative, as people would say today, by the late 30s, because they're the only ones left. The government ban on Fublacht. They ban lots of other Republican papers, but Sinn Féin are able to publish their material, and it's worth looking at, because again, this is being taped, and I'm going to be careful what we say in the current climate. But if you look at the politics of J.J. O'Kelly and Brian O'Higgins, and even Mary McSweeney, and you can't draw direct lines, but you can ask me where I think they'd have ended up. Some of them ended up there anyway. So it's interesting again, Tom Maguire, well-known Republican figure because of stuff that happens much later. He's a minor figure in the 20s and 30s. He's associated with Sinn Féin. 1931, he's supposed to be the speaker in Dublin for the Easter commemoration. The Dublin Brigade of the IRA say, no way. This man opposes the social policies of the movement. We don't want him as a speaker. So Sinn Féin are very much marginal, but they become much more central as everybody else either leaves or as the movement is repressed. And they fill a vacuum essentially by the late 1930s that kind of has dominated. The 1950s generation of Republicans would have thought really that's what everybody thought from the 20s on, when in fact I think they were a lot more diverse than that. But obviously the point is, what happened to this great left-wing current within the IRA? Fianna Fáil's time in government in the early 30s coincided with anti-communism becoming absolutely central to the Irish Catholic Church and therefore central to Irish nationalist life in a way it hadn't been in the 1920s. So in 1932-33 you have the Gralton affair in Leitrim, you've got the storming of Connolly House in Dublin. Ultimately the wave of pro-Franco hysteria in 1936 can't be divorced from that either. And the IRA were painfully aware in 1931-1932 that dozens of volunteers left as soon as the church began to condemn links to communism. And by 1933 they're trying to find ways of avoiding being denounced as communists. This is played out at the 1933 General Army Convention, which ultimately decides to formally forbid communists from being members of the IRA. So that's within 2 years of Moss Toomey, the leader, saying, well, if you want to call us communists, we are. To 1933-34 saying, we're absolutely not communists. There's a deep divide, and the minutes of that convention survive, and I'll wrap up. But I think one officer puts it well, and it's very significant, and again it reflects the times, not these times but then, when he says, "The Catholic Church tells me when it speaks it is infallible. I take that. It condemns communism. These people want to clear all religion out of the way." And that's a big, big factor in the rejection of communism, not just by the general public, but also by Republicans. It's seen as anti-Catholic, and most people are still very Catholic. There still is a strong left-wing current. O'Donnell, Gilmore, Frank Ryan by this stage all argue to try and revive Saor. The leadership say, no, we can't do that. We'll push those policies, but we won't call it Saor. It's very interesting in this debate. I know I've said it before, and I want people to think about this. Peadar O'Donnell, his strategy a lot of the time was when he put forward these arguments and was denounced for being too left-wing or unrealistic and so on, he said, well, Liam Mellows taught this. Liam Mellows taught this in Mountjoy in 1922. Mellows said to us, and he says at the convention, Liam Mellows had a great mind. He took the Workers' Republic, the communist paper, as a guiding line, and that's supposed to be a communist paper. It showed the attitude of the clergy towards every advanced nationalist movement. So O'Donnell puts it out there. I'm only doing what Mellows said we should do. Tom Barry, who'd only rejoined the IRA the year before, 1932, counters that Mellows was not infallible in these important matters. It was simply his opinion. We in 1922 would not accept his suggestions. Now, it's a kind of simple argument, but it's a kind of deadly one as well, basically. That's Grand Peadar, but we didn't agree with him then. We don't agree with you now. I think people who are interested in Mellows and his influence should look at the book edited by Conor McNamara of Mellows' own writings, because the Mellows that Socialist Republicans continually reference is the Mellows that Peadar O'Donnell and Desmond Greaves has created and recreated. Mellows was a dedicated anti-imperialist and Republican, but he was not the successor to James Connolly in the way that most people are not the successors to James Connolly. And that O'Donnell pushed Mellows all the time, because this is the way of saying to the IRA, this isn't alien, this isn't coming from Moscow, it's coming from Mountjoy. But I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And it might have limited value in the 21st century to continually reference this from 100 years ago as what we should be doing now as well. I think the state was worried by the Republican left. And I think the anti-communism in Irish life, to a lot of people when they look at it, it seems very unbalanced. It's like, there's a very small communist party, society is very conservative. Why is there all this anti-communism? It certainly influenced how the state saw things as well. I think it influenced how they saw Republicans in the 1960s, and it influenced them in the 1930s too. And there's just a quote I'll end on from a special branch report from September 1934 from the Garda superintendent. And what he said was that, this is following the Republican Congress split. He said, "It is thought that the orthodox IRA will never be a serious menace to the government as it at present is constituted. It is thought that the Republican Congress group under Peadar O'Donnell, which endeavours to get control of the labour organisations in the country for the purpose of creating general social disorder and internal chaos, will be a much greater menace. The more this organisation's efforts are thwarted by the existence of the orthodox IRA, the better. If the latter cease to exist, there will be much more recruitment to the Congress ranks with the inevitable social consequences." Now again, it's one Garda's opinion, and it might be obviously very determined by his own fear of communism, but nevertheless it is interesting that though the IRA had thousands of members and potentially thousands of weapons, the government were a bit more worried about this left-wing group who just left it. And again, sometimes we forget today, because I know there's quite a cult of Frank Ryan in some ways and others. Frank Ryan left the IRA in 1934. Peadar O'Donnell and George Gilmore left. They were denounced in much more vitriolic terms than De Valera had been a decade previously, although the split was largely without violence. And Ryan and Gilmore reassessed a lot of the stuff they'd done in the IRA as well. Frank Ryan is sharing platforms with ex-British soldiers in November 1934 at anti-Armistice Day commemorations and so on. So they were people who changed their ideas. It wasn't simply one line of continuity from the 1923 up till the 1930s. And I think they do deserve recognition, and they do deserve us looking at the lessons of the period. But in the 21st century, we're just not going to emulate that. And it'd be worthwhile if we could draw out, what we think about that. So I'll stop.